Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you're watching this. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I am an author, and welcome to my writing corner, where I'm going to be reading chapter 18 of my first book, The Shadow of the Past. I do hope you enjoy it. The various voices and performances, as well as the story and information. I would love for you to leave a comment down below what you thought of the reading, my voices, the story, the chapter, anything whatsoever. I would love to hear from you, as well as it'd be awesome if you were to like, share, subscribe. That would really help me in the channel out, as would checking out my website and my books, also linked down below. All right, without further ado, I'm going to get started here, though, with The Shadow of the Past, Chapter 18, The Coronation. Val'inar followed the path as it snaked slowly up the hill, and his mind was filled with all that had happened in the brief time since he had arrived at the Vale of Twilight. All he had seen, all he had heard, all he had learned. As he thought, he studied the stone that was in his hand. It was a dark blue which seemed to pulse with energy like a beating heart in his hand. Val'inar wished there had been a way to get the Guardians on his side for the fight to come, but he did not begrudge them their well-earned rest. Valinar's reverie was broken as the pass crested the jutting ridge, which was the southernmost point of Inare Cataer. He became aware that he was leaving the enchantment which kept the Vale in eternal twilight. It looked and felt as if he was rising out of a cloud of fog. He turned and looked back down the hill, and the path he walked upon, as well as the tops of the trees, was shrouded in a dark haze. Taking in this sight, he turned to face the center of the hill, and the sight he saw took his breath away. Whereas the other ancient seats of power he had visited were empty and decayed, and Inare Cataer had lost none of its splendor to the march of time. It looked to be made of the same stone the Guardians had been made out of, and in the sunlight it was a pale but rich blue color. From the ridge Val'inar was on, the path went straight to the front gate of the Citadel, and was lined with statues of great, long-gone elf lords arrayed for battle or clad in the robes of mages. The doors of the Citadel were intricately carved to resemble a row of armed soldiers, shields at the ready, eternally at guard. From the gate, the outer wall was a solid, unbroken line curving away to either side, punctuated by a dozen tall guard towers evenly spaced around the perimeter. The tops of each one looked not unlike the helm of a soldier. The citadel appeared to be one great building which rose in soaring vaults and arches to the central tower, which at a distance looked to take up more than a quarter of the fortress, and was open to the sky, although there were several arches rising from its outside hall to meet directly above its center. Save for the outer wall, every inch of Inare Cataer that Val'inar could see was intricately carved with scenes of war and peace, life and death, joy and sorrow. Val'inar stood and marveled at what he saw. The Citadel of Starlight was far more beautiful than he had been expecting, but it also exuded a sense of strength despite the grace and delicacy of the arches and carvings. Val'inar wondered if that impression was perhaps enhanced by the feeling of great power that came from the fortress itself. As with the other places he had met elementals, he felt the array of light and dark more strongly, but only a little. After several minutes of drinking in all of what he was seeing, Val'inar took a deep breath and strode forward. The path was shorter than it looked from a distance, or perhaps he was so overwhelmed with what was before him that he simply had not paid attention to the passage of time. Almost before he realized it, he had drawn even with the final pair of statues 100 strides or less from the gate. There seemed to be passing through these two statues a blue haze, which was all but invisible at a distance and seemed to curve around the entire citadel. Val'inar could only guess that this was the barrier which the elves spoke of. Taking a moment to steel himself, he strode through the barrier. As soon as his body touched the haze, Val'inar felt the briefest moment's resistance, but the stone in his hand suddenly grew warm, and that warmth quickly spread throughout his body. His whole body pulsed with a strange energy and warmth in time with the stone, and he walked effortlessly through the barrier. Once he was through, the warmth left as it had never been there, and looking back, Val'inar stretched forth his mind in the array, and after a moment's study of the intricacy of with which the enchantment had been woven, he smiled in appreciation at the craft that had gone into its creation. Alira was correct. He could have spent a millennia upon the hill and still not have found a way through. As Val'inar approached the gate, it opened. Without a rumble, without a groan, without the smallest sound, those massive doors swung silently inward. Val'inar reverently proceeded through, and as he was going down the long and thin passageway before him, he was aware of the doors swinging shut just as mutely. After progressing through the courtyard, at the center of which was a pool of deep, clear water with 4 pillars surrounding it, each topped with a leaping fish, Val'inar came to another long corridor. This one, however, was much wider and taller than the one that had led from the gate. This corridor proceeded to another large courtyard at the far end, of which was the entrance to the central tower of the Citadel. And judging by the raised platform a short distance from the door to the tower, Val'inar guessed this was for large social gatherings. Val'inar crossed this courtyard quickly, and this time was not surprised when the tower's doors swung inward without any living thing, as far as Val'inar could tell, touching them. Going through the arch gate, Val'inar found himself in a huge round tower, as he had guessed before, no roof. A giant oculus was directly above the center of the room, held up by 6 arches of stone. Val'inar did not marvel long at what kind of engineering skill the construction of the oculus took, because his attention was drawn to the throne. On a raised dais at the center of the room stood a throne of clear crystal, which caused the room to glimmer and dance with the sunlight refracted through it. Val'inar could not tell whether the throne had once been one great crystal or had been carefully constructed from many, but regardless, it seemed to have grown straight from the ground and rose to nearly twice Val'inar's height. The crystal had been expertly worked with various etched curves and lines that appeared differently from moment to moment. One moment it looked like a mighty tree, and another a dancing flame, or a tranquil sea, or a gust of wind, or a ray of light, or a patch of shadow. Val'inar approached the throne in awe, and when he drew close, he saw sitting upon the throne a diadem. The diadem was of a metal which Val'inar did not recognize. It shone of every color which Val'inar could name, although if he concentrated hard enough, the metal looked to be a silvery gray when there was not light for it to reflect. The metal had been intricately worked into 6 intertwined strands which met at the center, clasped in a great knot, with a crystal, the clearest, brightest, and most flawless crystal which Val'inar had ever seen. In his wonder, Val'inar almost did not notice the flicker of energy along the outside of the crystal, and indeed it had been so brief Val'inar was not sure whether it had happened at all. As Val'inar stood studying the diadem, he felt a change in the air. From behind him approached the final 2 elementals. A beam of sunlight seemed to take on a more solid form, and after a moment a woman of shimmering and flickering light stood before him. She looked as though she was wearing a long robe, although as the form changed from one moment to another he was not entirely sure. Beside this lady of light coalesced the form of the Lord of Darkness. The shadows of one of the ceiling vaults thickened and deepened, and after a moment a body of darkness and shadows, also constantly shifting and moving in the sunlight, stood before him. To Val'inar the shadows seemed rather like an armored dwarf. As with the other elementals, their eyes seemed to be the only thing about them which was not part of their ever-dancing and shifting forms. Her eyes were almost blindingly bright, and his were as 2 deep and glistening pools. "You have made it to the end of your journey, Val'inar, son of Inare." "You have made it to the end of your journey, Val'inar, son of Inare," boomed the Lord of Darkness, his voice like a deep and tremulous chord. "I am Moktan, Lord of the Element of Darkness, and this is Cilia, Lady of the Light." "I am pleased to have made your acquaintance," replied Val'inar, bowing in respect. "I have to claim that which is mine by right of birth and right of trial for the purpose of averting a great tragedy which even now hangs above Sirana." Cilia chimed in, her voice like a high, clear melody. "We know the danger which looms over us all, and the power that is here is indeed now the only power on this terra which has any chance of stopping Kirol." "What must I do to gain access to this power?" inquired Val'inar. Well, let us perhaps start with what we can personally do for you, boomed Mockton. As he said this, both he and Celia raised their arms, and as had happened 4 times before, Val'inar felt himself double over in pain, overwhelmed by the sensation of the air rushing through his body, opening up new paths and new connections and making him stronger. The pain was momentary, and as it passed, his body felt as if it were both shimmering with light and shrouded with darkness. We also have gifts to present you, Val'inar, said Celia, indicating 2 items which lay beside the throne. The first is a cloak woven of midnight thread. When it is worn, it will protect you from notice of any whom you wish to hide from. The second is your forefather's sword. He left it for the one whom he knew would one day come to claim his birthright. It is of Elean steel, and it is almost certainly the hardest and sharpest weapon you will find upon this terra, save perhaps the axe Glimtra which Kiral wields in battle. It is also the perfect channel for your magecraft in battle. I thank you most sincerely for all that you have done with me, said Val'inar, bowing once more. I shall endeavor to use the power you give me wisely in honor of my forefather, as I am honored to bear his sword. Tell me, however, how is it that I can make use of this fortress? The diadem is the answer, replied Mockton. Place it upon your head, and the power that lies in this place, the power of your forefather, will be yours to control. Celia added, the people of this terra need a leader, a firm hand to guide them through times of trouble, and by placing that diadem upon your head, you will become that leader. Val'inar turned and gently picked up the diadem, taking no notice of the spark of energy which jumped from the diadem to his hand when he touched it, and contemplated it for a few moments in his hand, whispering almost to himself, I do not know if I am worthy of being a king, but I see now that there is little other choice. And with that he lifted the diadem to his head, and taking a seat upon the throne, gently slid it down upon his head. It fit perfectly. As soon as the diadem's crystal touched his forehead, however, Val'inar suddenly felt as if the gem was white hot, and before he could react or do anything, he got the strong sensation that a red-hot iron was being shoved into his head. He screamed in agony, but no sound came out. Just as the pain reached a crescendo, it ceased, as if it had never been there, and after a moment's hesitation, Valinar's eyes shut open. It was now late evening, and globes, floating and pulsing with a soft white light, lit the chamber. There was a collection of elves, some of them armed, but all of them garbed for travel, now stood to Valinar's left. Some of them seemed to be crying, all seemed somber. There was another group clad in near translucent white that were clustered, kneeling immediately in front of the throne. Both groups seemed to be looking at something that was behind the throne and to Valinar's left. Before he could turn to look, Val'inar was struck by 2 strange things. The first was that there seemed to be something too real about the figures. Their clothes and indeed their very skin seemed too vivid, and the textures off as well. The wool garments seemed too coarse, the stonework too smooth, and the light rather too bright. The other strange thing was that none of the elves standing before him, nor indeed any of the guards scattered around the room, were moving at all. They did not twitch, they did not blink, they were still as statues. It was then that Val'inar noticed that the leader of the priests and priestesses, for that was what Val'inar guessed they were, was Alira. He gave a cry of surprise and bolted from the throne toward her. They really do look alike, don't they? Mused a voice behind Val'inar, causing him to whip around. Standing beside the throne was a tall and brown-skinned elf wearing well-cut brown trousers, a loose-fitting forest green shirt with a midnight blue sash tied around his waist, a cape of the same midnight blue, and a silver coronet upon his head. He had a straight, shoulder-length black hair and the most startling silver eyes that Val'inar had ever seen. Who? Stammered Val'inar. I am Tor'inar, once called Glorilir, last king of the highborn elves, said the elf, smiling kindly and resuming after a pause. No, not the last king, for that honor goes to you, whom I knew would come, and the need for which I foresaw when I sent my family and most loyal retainers away, and sealed this place against the greedy and the power-hungry. What is this? Inquired Val'inar. I have never seen its like. This, said Tor'inar as he gestured around the room, is the last memory of a dead elf. I too never saw magic like this in my life, and I do not know how it works, even though it was done at my behest. Who did this? Was it one of the six? No, I have a feeling this is beyond the power and skill of the six. And Kiral too, I expect, replied Tor'inar, indicating what was taking place behind the throne. He came the day Kiral was sealed away, and even the six were afraid of him. And he, for his part, was quite furious with what they had done. Val'inar considered the scene behind the throne. There was a bed set up on the far side of the room upon which lay a much different Tor'inar than the image that he was speaking with. He seemed frail and weak laying on the bed, bearing a great wound across his chest and ravaged by the power of Kiral. Around the bed were the six incorporeal forms, still at the height of their power. Maramas still looked to be composed of tree branches, but he wore long green robes and towered above the others. Shiniri's skin seemed to glisten with many different colors as obsidian glass so often does. Her red robes seemed dry and parched, and the air around her shimmered. Lyra looked as if she had just gotten out of the water, given the matted look of her hair and the way that both her body and the seafoam-colored dress she wore almost dripped with water. Andaran was dressed in sandy-colored robes with an iron breastplate over them. His robes and his hair looked like they were both constantly fluttering in the breeze. Celia and Mockton were both more difficult to see. She was wearing nearly the same translucent white material the priests and priestesses were, and he was wearing dark-colored armor over black robes. Her entire body seemed to radiate light, and he seemed ever shrouded in darkness. Standing apart from all of them was another man, nearly as tall as Maramas. He wore simple brown robes which parted slightly in front to reveal an ornately carved chestplate with images of men riding dragons, which was in turn worn over a simple red tunic which came down to his knees. He was bound by a leather belt at his waist. He wore boots of strong brown leather. His hair was straight, browned, and was bound into a high ponytail with a strip of leather. He had intricately carved bracers of a silvery metal, also featuring dragons, which clasped the wrists of his muscular arms. He appeared to carry no weapons. His left hand rested gently on Tor'inar's head, with his thumb and ring finger touching the latter's temples. He held the diadem in the other hand, and several slivers of energy, purple in color, seemed to be passing from Tor'inar's head through the man and into the coronet. These slivers of energy seemed the most realistic thing in the whole frozen moment of time, which led Val'inar to guess that they were what he was experiencing. Very good, laughed Tor'inar, breaking Valinar's reverie. What you are seeing is both all the power that I possessed at my death as well as my consciousness, imprinted by arts beyond my comprehension, so that I can give you a message. How did you know what I was thinking? Inquired Val'inar, although he had already guessed the answer. Right again, nodded Tor'inar. The imprint may be in the coronet, but the conversation is playing out inside your head, and for as long as this vision lasts, I have access to everything you know and every thought that you have. That is also how I knew that Ea and her distant descendant Lyra look alike. Why do this? The question fairly burst from Valinar's lips. Such was his curiosity piqued. What could possibly be so important that you would send your own family into exile and leave this apparition behind? I sent my family into exile to remove them from the trappings of power, to prevent the same fall into arrogance and corruption which took hold of Kiral and the Six, replied Tor'inar, for the first time losing his warm smile that had been on his face the entire conversation and replacing it with a grim countenance. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but has paid off. The very fact that you, one of my descendants, is standing here, wearing the diadem, with the full knowledge that fighting and killing are not the only things one must be willing to do in order to be a true ruler, are proof that I did was right. The Six fell into corruption? Is that what you wanted to tell me? Yes, they are guilty of the same crime that Kiral is. Worse, perhaps. I had this remembrance prepared because I knew that when the time came, the Six would lie to you about what had happened all those millennia ago. Val'inar was concerned at this. I knew that they were not telling me everything, but I did not realize that they were lying. He shuddered. If I had known that they were using me, I would have never accepted their gifts. Tor'inar smiled at this. These gifts will still prove useful, and they were well meant, that is the trouble. Everything they have done, indeed everything that Kiral has done, has been well meant. But they are so wrapped up in themselves that they no longer realize that they are lying, and most of their lies have been ones of omission. And in order to make the right decision in the times that are coming, I felt that once someone finally wore the coronet again, they would have a different they should have a different perspective on the matter. Well then, said Val'inar firmly, tell me everything. Tor'inar nodded. You know that Kiral and the Six came here long ago, and for a time they lived simple lives out of the way of the inhabitants of the Terra. They gave advice when sought out, but mainly contented themselves to just live a quiet life. After some great disaster of which I do not know, in which they were forced to step in and act, they decided that they should take a more active role in the affairs of the Terra. To get around the ancient laws which prohibited direct interference from outsiders, the seven of them, or so the most ancient of our legends go, sought out an ancient power, imprisoned here years beyond counting before the seven came here, and learned of a ritual by which the seven were bound to the six elements in this Terra, and Kiral acting as the keystone between the six. They had the power to affect anything involving their chosen element anywhere on the Terra to a tremendous degree, and of course Kiral was the greatest of them. From that time there was a great age in which the seven worked to make the peoples and societies of this world better. It was during this time that many of the great cities and towers that are present on this Terra were constructed, and not only that, but they used their great power to enhance the lifespan, the physical skills, and connection to the area of all Serana's people. Even during this time, however, the seven acted as little more than advisors, pushing and nudging when necessary, but never really directly enforcing peace or standing in the way of wars. It was during this time that the seven worked together to create the Seera Elfen. After all, it is a rare occurrence that when even one elf child is born who feels the pull of all the elements equally. I do not know how it happened in the end, but eventually Kiral decided that he could prevent wars and solve all the problems of the Terra if he were in direct control of all of Serana. The six went along with this at first, as did all the mortal races, but eventually Kiral went too far, and the highborn, proudest creations of Kiral turned against him, and soon the six and the kingdoms which they were closest to as well. With Kiral stood the entire Orcish people, as well as a great number of humans, goblins, dwarves, and elves. The war was long and bloody. There were often decades between battles, but the threat was always there, and we lived ever in fear of Kiral's great power. Finally, after millennia, I came to the throne, and suspicious of the six, I found much of this information out on my own, through careful digging through the archives of the fortress. Learning of their manipulation, the lies, the enhancement of our power as a way of bribing us, and many other things they did to us, I called a secret meeting with both the leaders of the groups who follow the six and the followers of Kiral as well. I laid the evidence I had collected before them and told them that I had found a way to both remove Kiral from the picture and throw off his balance and that of the six, if throw off his influence and that of the six forever. In the end, even Kiral's followers agreed to throw off their power and trappings given us to bribe and control our actions. When I got to my plan concerning Kiral, the leader of the Orcish people, Rastar tacitly agreed that the war would end if Kiral were to be removed from the picture, but he refused as a matter of honor to turn against Kiral, who had done so much good for his people over the millennia. I, to this day, greatly respect his honor and bravery for saying so to a room full of his enemies. With this in mind, I proposed my scheme to the sixth, and they acknowledged that they would bind Kiral if he were weakened, if only for a few moments from losing at last his true body. With that in mind, I offered battle to Kiral, and at the height of that battle I challenged him to a duel. Knowing that I would die in return, I was able to strike him down. As promised, the sixth appeared to bind Kiral, but they betrayed me. They had told me that they would only bind him, but they instead used the enchantment on all those who followed Kiral and all the lands they had inhabited, folding nearly a third of Sirana into a magical prison from which there is no escape. Though Kiral's followers served him through honor and gratitude, the Six claimed that they were corrupted by Kiral and his thinking, and could not possibly coexist with us. I promised that there was not the I promised that was not the case, and that I had persuaded them to throw off his gifts, but they said it was too late. Kiral's followers could not be freed without also freeing Kiral. Val'inar was stunned by all these revelations and was speechless for several minutes. I thought the weakness of the mortal races was a result of Kiral's curse while he was being sealed away. He did not curse the Six and all the others who contributed to his defeat while he was being sealed away. But the curse was never anything more than verbal, and the Six never did learn that we had cast off the powers they granted us. It is not surprising that they would therefore put down their down our It is not surprising that they would therefore put down our slow weakening and their inability to influence us down to the curse they heard, acknowledged Tor'inar. With so much of Sirana bound away and the rest warped out of shape, as a result, there is no telling what effects it has had on those living on this terra, regardless of whether they realized it or not. And in addition, it is no doubt created a vengeful group out of Kiral's followers, unjustly imprisoned for 10 millennia. Where does he fit into all this? Inquired Val'inar, indicating the man performing the incantation on the coronet. I do not know his name or where he came from, responded Tor'inar. He arrived just after the sealing was completed, and the Six seemed to know him and fear him. He was furious with them, from what my servants reported to me, but when he came to speak to me, he praised my courage and said that he regretted that he was unable to save my life, that my body and life force were too badly damaged. And after I had talked to him at length, he told me that he could do this, and I asked him to put the power I wielded into this coronet and to imprint my personality upon it as well. While drifting in and out of consciousness, I woke up one time to an argument between him and the Six. After a cutting rebuke against the Six's actions, Shiniri, ever quick to anger, shouted that she would burn him to cinders. I caught a glimpse of his face. He smiled broadly at her, but his eyes dared her to try. I don't think I ever saw her back down that promptly. Shortly afterwards, I gathered my family retainers and the priestess of the moon and priests of the stars and gave my final orders before the man did as I asked him to, and that is all I remember. Val'inar sighed heavily, absorbing everything that he had just been told. What am I to do now? I have acquired all the power that I possibly can, and I fear that I still am not nearly strong enough to challenge the outside forces missing us, let alone Kiral, should the prison be undone. Tor'inar smiled sympathetically and put his hand gently on Valinar's shoulder. You must find your own path. Do not let others guide you. I cannot advise you in anything except in this. Don't repeat the sins of the past, even if you cannot fix them. If you avoid that, then you will have made me proud, and all this will have been worth it. Will I be able to speak with you again? No, I am but the echo of a long dead elf, and when you leave this place, you will never see me again. But you know that I am always with you. Go with my blessing. Val'inar felt drawn to sit upon the throne once more, and as he did, the vision around him began to blur with only the tendrils of energy, and the image of Tor'inar remained clear. As the room, as it really was, began to return to his vision, the ghostly image of Tor'inar seemed to dissolve into a mass of swirling colors and passed into his body. The last thing he heard was, I have given you what little wisdom I possess, as now I give you what I am. Valinar's eyes snapped open as he had been asleep, and at first thought that only a few seconds had passed. Given that Celia and Mockton were in the same position they were in when he had placed the diadem upon his head. However, a quick glance around the room showed that the shadows had lengthened considerably, and about the throne were gathered all of the elves who had lived in the Vale. How, he said before Celia preempted his response, you have sat there for half a day as you absorb the power that is within this place, and in the meantime we summon all those who would now serve you to your presence. The barrier has fallen, then he said. The moment the diadem touched your head, it ceased to be the franchise. Oh, I lost my. I found the moment the diadem touched your head, it ceased to be its function served. Boomed Mockton. And how may I serve you all? Inquired Val'inar, turning towards the room's other occupants. No, smiled Lyra. How would we serve you? Upon this saying, she stepped forward and fell to one knee. Behind her, Iraine and all the other elves had made a similar motion. Once they were all upon one knee, they intoned in unison, Hail to Val'inar, son of Ynira, high king of the Saera Elfen and lord of Inare Cataer. Val'inar rose from the throne and motioned for them to rise. Thank you. I shall endeavor to live up to the example of my ancestor and forge a better future for us all. All right, that is chapter 18. I really hope you enjoyed it. Once more, I would absolutely love for you to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you thought, as well as check out my website and book. Everything is linked down below. But in the meantime, I do hope you all have a wonderful day, get the chance to do or experience something creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.